Today, we're going to go through common interview questions and the best ways to answer them. So a bit of context first. For a number of years, as I was working as a corporate lawyer, I acted as a professional mentor for students at my former university to help them with their own job hunts and navigating their own careers. On top of this, during my time as a lawyer, I helped my firm out with a number of graduate recruitment activities which did involve talking to partners and people in HR to really find out what kind of candidates we were looking for and what we wanted to know about them. And while I stayed at the same firm the entire time I was working as a lawyer, Em actually worked at 3 different firms, so she attended a lot of interviews in her day and did a lot of prep herself. So today we're going to share everything we've learned over the years in this video to help you guys with your interviews. And before we get into it, if you enjoyed this video or get some value from it, make sure to hit the like button, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments how your interview goes or if you have any tips of your own to share. We'd love to hear from you guys.
While you won't get this question in all of your interviews, it's definitely a very common question that I've gotten several times myself. In order to address this well, you basically want to have a summary of what you do in your current role, as well as your background or story leading up to that prepared in advance. You want to make sure to keep this part concise, maybe 2 minutes max, and also relevant to the job that you're there interviewing for. Don't ramble or go into personal anecdotes that aren't relevant. Answering this question is actually also a great way to segue into something you'd like to highlight about yourself to your interviewer as well. In my interviews to lateral between law firms, since I had already worked as a lawyer for a few years already, I didn't spend that much time talking about the earlier portion of my career, in which I spent some time doing some work that wasn't that relevant to the kind of work that I would be doing in the position that I was applying for. Instead, I spent more time talking about the most relevant experience I had gained in the couple of years preceding those interviews. I also used this as an opportunity to talk about a major case that I had worked on, which was a highlight on my CV, and which I knew the interviewers would be interested in and want to ask me about. Of course, if you're asked this in an interview for a first job, then your answer will be different, but the same principles still apply. You may want to cover instead courses that you took or activities you did in school or relevant experience that you got in different internships. As for rounding out your answer to this question, I found that more often than not, before I got to finish, I already started receiving questions from my interviewers about my experience. But if that doesn't happen, I would just think of a nice and concise way to tie together all of your background and your experience to explain why you're interested in that role that you're interviewing for and why you're a good candidate for it.
So this one really depends on seniority and what level you're at in your career. So if you're someone relatively junior, I think it's kind of okay to still be in that phase where you're wanting to learn things, you're wanting to gain experience, and you're still kind of figuring out what exactly you want to specialize into or what you want to end up doing as your career. For example, junior lawyers at some firms will go through rotations for the first couple of years to try out different teams and see what kind of work they're interested in. So if you're in a relatively junior position, it's totally fine to say that you're not 100% sure, but you want to be in a position where after gaining certain experience or picking up certain skills, that you're in a better position to figure out exactly what you want to specialize into or where you want to go. Of course, if you're applying for a job that actually does have rotations or allows you to try out different things within the business, that's a great thing. And I think it's important for you to mention that that's something that appeals to you greatly because you are still trying to figure things out. On the flip side, if you do have a very strong idea of exactly what you want to do, then by all means, go for it. But I think the important thing here is to be able to explain why you think a job at the place you're applying to or interviewing with is actually going to help you get to where you want to go. Now, there is a bit of a meme answer here too, where when asked this question, we all kind of think of that situation where it's like, oh, what do you want to do in 5 years? And the response is, oh, sitting in your seat doing your job. And, I think while that does show confidence, it also shows arrogance in a way, and I think it doesn't really fully answer the question because at the end of the day, the most important thing is, again, being able to justify what it is at that job that'll help you get where you want to go, as opposed to just having blind ambition. Now, I have heard stories too about people interviewing and saying, oh, I really want to be doing this thing in 5 years, but I really don't want to be doing X, Y, or Z things. And I think that's always something to be careful about for a couple of reasons. The first is that if you're saying that you don't like something, I think you need to have a pretty good reason as to why. And this is, again, particularly true if you're very junior. Sometimes people talk about a type of work they don't like or talk about something that they think they're not going to be interested in, having not ever really done it before. And I think that can come across as not so great because you're kind of jumping to conclusions without having tried the thing itself. Generally speaking, when you're interviewing for a job, I think traits that stand out are willingness to try things and sort of willingness to keep an open mind. And I think by saying that you don't like something, it kind of shows that you're a bit closed off and might be difficult to work with. And the other reason is that you never really know who you're speaking to. I mean, I once saw an intern speaking to a partner and kind of talking about a practice area that that person really didn't want to do, said that they thought it was really dry and boring and hated it, not knowing that that partner was actually from that team in the firm. So yeah, needless to say, the partner wasn't too pleased to hear that, and I think generally in these types of situations, again, it's totally fine to have a preference or an idea of what you want to do, but keeping an open mind is always a good idea, and closing yourself off and saying that things are boring or you don't want to do something without really having a very good reason is a bit dicey at times. So again, regardless of the answer for this question, it's always good to have reasons and supporting evidence to justify why you want to be at a certain position in 5 years, and also good to explain why the job you're applying for appeals to you with that 5-year goal in mind.
You'll probably hear this more for non-entry-level positions, but I think it's still common to get some variation of this. It may just be phrased in different ways. Essentially, the interviewer wants to know what you've worked on was high impact, or which pushed you to grow, or which you learned a lot from. This is definitely one you want to prepare really thoroughly for and not only have one example in mind, but preferably also a backup if you can. Make sure you re-familiarize yourself with the details of the matter and the issues that you dealt with if necessary, and explain what the challenges that you faced were. Most importantly, make sure you also talk about how you addressed or dealt with the challenge and what you learned from it. The point when answering this question is not so much about using this as a chance to talk about the biggest or most impressive cases or deals you've worked on, although those might very well have been the ones that were most challenging. Instead, the point is to demonstrate how you deal with difficult situations, what your problem-solving process is, and how you learn and grow as a person. As a simple example, one of the challenges that I've cited before in one of my more difficult cases was dealing with an enormous amount of documentation as a small team. In order to effectively manage and also understand the contents of more than 10,000 documents, it not only required a very high level of organization, but also good communication with the client who's giving the documents to us. Also, it might go without saying, but when talking about the difficulties or challenges that you face, don't sound like you're complaining or present them in a negative light. The focus should really be on how you handle things and what you learn from it.
So greatest strength is pretty straightforward. I think it's a good one for you to talk about something that you're really proud of and to give some more context into your character and something that you want to highlight to the interview community. This can be anything, but it's also worth considering what your strengths are in light of the job that you're applying to. So for example, if you're applying to a job at a law firm to be a lawyer and you say, well, my greatest strength is that I'm really good at musical instruments, that might not be the best answer. If you think about the job description working at a law firm, you would think, okay, well, that requires a lot of teamwork, that requires a lot of analytical skills, and maybe those are things that you think you're really good at. And so those would be really good answers for this question, again, tying into the specific job that you're looking for. On top of this, I think it's really good to have evidence to support why you think you're strong at a certain thing. For example, I think if you say, I think I'm really strong at teamwork, but when asked about it further, you don't really have examples of when you've worked as a team or when you've worked through difficult things as a team, then the answer feels a bit weak. On the flip side, if you say that your strengths lie in being a team player and you have a number of examples where you've worked in a team and have overcome things with your ability to work with a team, then I think that makes that answer a lot stronger. So again, two things here. I think the best answer will be one that's appropriate for the job and one which you can support through evidence. So moving on to greatest weakness, I think there's a big trap here because a lot of people tend to gravitate towards thinking that they want to hide a strength as a weakness when answering this question. For example, one of the most common answers we hear is, oh, I'm too much of a perfectionist, or, I have too much attention to detail, or things like this. They're not really weaknesses. Fundamentally, your interviewers are people too, and they'll be able to see through that whole thing. So in my experience, I think the best way to answer that question is to actually give a genuine response as to something that you perceive as being a weakness. However, there are a couple things to keep in mind. Firstly, I think it is important to be genuine, but you obviously also don't want to go too far in the opposite direction and just start talking about all the things that you think you're not really good at. And kind of using the example from the strengths portion, if you're applying to a law firm, you think, yeah, teamwork would be a really good skill, but I'm really bad at teamwork. And you go into the interview saying, my greatest weakness is that I can't work with other people. That probably isn't going to work out so well for you. The second and probably most important thing is that it's important to talk about something that you've actively taken steps to fix. So from the interviewer's perspective, there is going to be that recognition that we're all human, we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. What's important is being able to identify our weaknesses and take steps to try to improve ourselves. So here's a personal example, and I was asked this question when I was interviewing for my initial job, and I'd probably give a different answer today if I were asked the same question, but at the time I answered, I'm not really good at taking on solo projects and working on things by myself that are completely self-motivated. However, I did also mention that I understood this about myself and that I'd taken steps to try to remedy this by taking on research projects and trying to get a paper published in an academic journal. I also mentioned that I was actively pursuing a master's program, which I thought was more independent study that would help me break out of my shell a little bit and get into more solo work, which I thought would be beneficial for me. I think this gave the partners the impression that I understood a weakness that I had and that I was taking steps to try to remedy it to try to improve myself in that regard. And ultimately, I did get the job, so there you go.
Generally speaking, when you get this question, the interviewer is looking to get a better feel for you as a person and to also see if you're a good fit for that position or that team or that firm or company. There's definitely different ways to approach answering this question, and it's definitely not one size fits all. But essentially, you want to talk about something that demonstrates a positive quality about yourself that's relevant to the job in some way or another. I personally have talked about a variety of different things, from an aspect of my previous job that I hadn't expressly talked about on my CV, to my previous experience working in food and beverage, to talking about my hobbies. I do think it's a bonus if the example you talk about is something interesting or a little different that makes you a memorable candidate. Since if you consider the perspective of the interviewers, they probably have interviewed quite a lot of candidates with similar profiles. Of course, this is still keeping in mind that the example you use is appropriate and not overly personal and irrelevant. An example that's worked well for me before was the semester I spent working at a bar in my last year of law school. That job actually taught me a ton of soft skills for working in the service industry, which translated well because, like food and beverage, law is also a service industry. The partner who was interviewing me actually got really excited about that example, and I moved on to the next round of interviews.
Okay, we're closing it out with this one because this is a bit of a meme question. But I was actually asked this when I interviewed for my job. I actually think back to this question a lot because I think it's a very interesting interview question that if you are asked it, there's an interesting strategy to go about this one. The thing to keep in mind is it's not really an actual sales pitch scenario because it's an interview, you're being interviewed, and the interviewers know that you're in a position where you're not actually trying to sell them a pen, you're just trying to show them that you know how to sell a pen. So as the person that's trying to sell the pen, you're kind of screwed because you're not really in a position where you're actually going to convince anyone to buy a pen. However, on the flip side, I do think a lot of times when interviewers ask this question, they themselves don't really know exactly what they're looking for. They're asking it for a number of reasons, maybe to test how you respond to the situation, to see how you might approach a very difficult task like that, or even just to see how your approach to sales might theoretically work in practice. So I think being in this position, if you're asked this question or any other meme question that's similar to this, you want to think about, okay, how do I want to conduct myself? How do I want to present myself? And what message do I want to get across to the interviewers, even though they're not going to buy this pen from me? It's just not going to happen. So in my case, when I was asked the question, the partner slid a stapler over to me and said, "Sell me the stapler." And I remember I kind of approached it by thinking, okay, well, sales is kind of an emotional thing. I think you want to, attach the idea of the stapler to some kind of emotional event that signals a cue of, oh, every time I use the stapler, it's a positive experience. So I remember the way I went for it was trying to connect this emotional experience of completing a deal or signing documents to using the stapler. I think even the interviewers at the time didn't really know how to respond to what I was saying, and I think it was kind of just, chuckling and kind of banter on either side. But again, I think it was more of a testing how I approached the situation as opposed to how I actually sold the item. But again, there's definitely no right or wrong answer for this one. I think it's definitely a bit of a meme, and I would be surprised if this came up in a very serious interview. I think this is one of those ones where, maybe if they're not really sure what to ask or just want to get to know you a little bit better, you might get a curveball like this, but I wouldn't necessarily bank on it either. So if you made it this far and you've enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments how your interview goes or what other videos you want to see. We always love hearing from you guys. And we'll catch you guys in the next one.